A hard wind came in from the Blackwater marsh, sour with brackish reeds and wood smoke, and the old house at Reddick Plantation groaned as though it were a gallows too long in use. The rafters shuddered, shutters clattered against the frame, and in the quarters across the yard the sound carried like a summons. Within those cramped cabins a hush lay thick, as if even the children knew that silence could sometimes be the only prayer a body dared utter. It was harvest week in Dorchester County, and the main house stood lit as a lantern in the countryside, its windows shimmering with dance, fiddle, and laughter that did not belong to the enslaved. Inside, planters and neighbors drank cider steeped in nutmeg and sang of bounty. Outside, hunger crouched and listened. Temperance Ruth, called Tempe by the few who loved her, sat on the edge of a low pallet, the straw pricking through the thin ticking, and counted to herself the 7 throats that had marked her life. A throat could order, price, preach, lie, hunt, tally, bless. She recited them as if rehearsing a catechism, her lips moving without sound. Beneath her coarse dress, stitched into a hem that had already been darkened with old stains, lay the farrier's hoof knife, narrow and sharp, its wooden handle polished smooth by years of other men's work. She had bartered for it with silence and risk, 1 tin button traded to a blacksmith's boy in the spring. Tonight it sat heavy as a millstone upon her heart, and yet it was also featherlight, for it was the only thing that promised weight, might finally balance. Flashbacks pressed around her like cold hands. She saw her sister Dorcas march to the river landing, a rope tugging at her wrists, while Mistress Prudence Reddick bent close to inspect her teeth like a mare's, haggling over the price with a merchant who smelled of molasses and gun oil. She heard again the snap of Overseer Ezekiel Hartwell's boot upon a boy's cheekbone, heard the hollow crack that followed. She felt Reverend Phineas Crowther's voice like a lash across her back when he stood in the pulpit beneath a cedar roof and declared that obedience was the balm God demanded of the servant. Words had always been the first blow, whips only followed after. But the sharpest memory came from a mound of earth not 50 paces from the cabins, where the soil had never quite settled flat. A year before, Tempe had knelt there as the grave, swallowed the body of her daughter Mercy. The child's fever had burned red and wild, her breaths ragged as torn cloth, and Tempe had begged Abel Trask, the plantation's accountant, for the medicine the doctor left in town. Trask had sneered and shut the ledger before her eyes, declaring that a dose of quinine cost more than the quarter's yield. The child had stiffened in Tempe's arms that night, and her small jaw slackened before the cock crowed. It was at that mound, the dirt damp and clinging to her fingers, that Tempe made the vow. Now, with lanterns blazing in the house and the fiddler's bow screeching merriment through the windows, the vow pressed upon her chest like iron. She knew the night was thin of watch. Hiram Bell, the patrol captain, and his men had grown drunk on cider near the smokehouse, their voices booming like beasts in a pen. The dogs, restless and howling at dusk, had already been calmed with scraps Tempe had dipped in laudanum filched spoon by spoon over months. The great back gallery door, iron-latched, hung with its keys from a bent nail she had studied since spring. Every creak of the hinge, every weakness in the grain of the step, she had mapped in memory as a cartographer maps rivers. Tempe's eyes narrowed to the glow spilling from the great house. Each window was like a gash of light in the night, and each gash seemed to mock her. She thought of Prudence Reddick's soft laugh, the trill that followed her when she ordered a child stripped bare for inspection. She thought of Ambrose Reddick, the colonel, whose cane struck the earth as though every footfall must confirm his dominion. She thought of Ezekiel, Silas Alder the driver, Abel Trask with his columns of debt, Hiram Bell with his whip smile, and Crowther who dared to call chains holy. Each one of them breathed easy tonight, bellies full, voices strong, their throats open in song or command. Mercy's throat had closed with fever, and no man had spent a coin to keep it open. The night felt swollen, as though the marsh itself had crept closer to hear. The reeds whispered against each other in the wind, and owls turned their heads in silence. Tempe's pulse beat in her fingertips, and her mind hummed with the weight of the knife hidden in her hem. She had measured her fear so many times it had become smaller than hunger, smaller than thirst. What was left now was something beyond fear, something that tasted of metal and salt, like the brackish water that lapped at the plantation's edge. She rose from the pallet slowly, her back stiff, her hands folded as if she were about to pray. Around her the quarters lay silent. Only the rasp of sleep came from the straw mats, only the restless cough of the old and the very young. No one asked where she was going. Perhaps they sensed it. Perhaps the silence itself was their benediction. She stepped into the night, the cold air wrapping her like a shroud, and crossed the yard with the steady pace of a woman who had carried too many burdens to stumble. The house loomed larger with every step, its clapboard siding glowing faintly beneath the lantern light, its chimneys coughing smoke into the night sky. At the foot of the gallery steps she paused, her hand hovering near her hem. She looked once, toward the marsh where the wind blew colder, and she thought of Mercy's grave, the earth that had clung to her fingers, the vow whispered through gritted teeth. Then she looked toward the house again, where laughter spilled like liquor from the windows. The two sounds, the silence of the grave and the laughter of the living, seemed to braid together until her breath caught between them. She lifted her eyes to the gallery door. The keys dangled from their nail like a beckoning finger, swinging gently with each draft of air that seeped through the cracks. Tempe's lips moved in silence. Not a prayer to the God Reverend Crowther preached, but a word she had kept close since Mercy's death. It was not English, not the language of ledgers and sermons, but a syllable her mother had whispered in her childhood, a scrap of sound carried from a coast far across the ocean. That word steadied her hand. Her fingers brushed the hem where the hoof knife lay stitched. The handle pressed against her skin, warm now as though it had gathered the heat of her resolve. Tempe knew she would not live long after this night. The law would swallow her, the rope would find her neck. Yet for the first time in her 29 years, she would hold dominion over a house that had claimed dominion over her. The thought was not triumph, but stillness, a terrible stillness that wrapped her lungs and gave her breath. The wind pressed hard again, rattling the shutters, and the house creaked as though every beam knew what was coming. Tempe's hand closed around the first iron key. She lifted it from the nail, careful, silent, and held it like a relic. The sound of music dimmed in her ears until all she heard was her own heartbeat. She stood on the edge of the act. The night balanced on the knife's edge and drew in a single breath before the world must change. The marsh went quiet, as if it too held its breath. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. The iron of the gallery door yielded beneath her hand with a soft groan, and the sound seemed to echo down the marrow of her bones. Tempe froze, breath caught in her throat, until the next scrape of fiddle from the ballroom swallowed it. Slowly, carefully, she tested the hinge again, easing it wider by degrees, the wood swelling against the cold night air. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen hearth heavy with fat, and mingled with the odor of the marsh, a scent that to Tempe carried the flavor of chains because it was always there, the salt breath of captivity. As she held the latch, her mind slipped backward, dragged into the first reckoning of her worth. 8 years earlier in Cambridge, she had stood on a wooden block while men with purses at their belts called out numbers. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell, and her name, Temperance Ruth, was shortened to Tempe for swifter chanting. She remembered how her sister Dorcas clutched her hand until a driver struck them apart, and how Mistress Prudence Reddick stood to one side, her gloved hands busy with a little mother-of-pearl case. Inside it lay rows of needles, and she counted them as if every stitch would earn her another coin. Colonel Ambrose Reddick, tall and severe, lifted his cane and bit on Tempe as one might signal for more wine. Sound and strong, the auctioneer declared, as if she were horseflesh. The gavel fell, and a portion of her life was settled into Ambrose's ledger. Now the iron of the gallery door beneath her palm felt like the same gavel, and she thought of the price stamped invisible on her back. She pushed, and the wood creaked inward, a sigh from the house itself. She slipped inside, the hem of her dress brushing the boards she had studied for months. Each step carried memory. She knew which plank bowed near the wainscot, which joint would squeal if pressed too sharply, and where the floor breathed without sound. It was knowledge she had gathered as she swept and polished, always invisible, always silent, her labor training her now for vengeance. From the hall came the faint smell of tallow smoke and the shuffling laughter of men. She flattened herself against the paneling, listening. Upstairs the floorboards hummed beneath dancing shoes, but nearer by, behind the closed door of the study, Abel Trask's voice murmured. He was counting again. Numbers spilled from him like prayers, sums of cotton bales, sums of human lives, sums of debts owed and collected. Tempe could hear the scratch of his quill on the ledger, and she knew that among the neat columns of ink her name appeared, perhaps abbreviated to TR, her value reduced to a dollar figure that determined how much food she received and how many lashes she must endure before her labor was spoiled. Her jaw tightened, and she slipped farther down the hall. The knife in her hem tapped lightly against her thigh with each step, a reminder, a companion. Yet what guided her was not frenzy, it was arithmetic. Every death tonight had been calculated like an entry in Abel Trask's ledger. Reverend Crowther, guest room north stair. Abel Trask, study, quill scratching, lips moving. Hiram Bell, smokehouse, cider drunk, his patrolman useless. Silas Alder, corn crib watch, eyes heavy from drink. Ezekiel Hartwell, loft above the tack room, boot by his side. Prudence Reddick, second floor, east chamber. Colonel Ambrose Reddick, west chamber, cane at the bedpost. 7, always 7. Tempe carried the list in her mind as surely as any preacher carried scripture. A memory surged again, jagged as Ezekiel's lash. She saw Josiah, her husband, his back bared and his body bent over the whipping post because he would not speak the name of the man who had hidden a book beneath the floorboard of the quarters. The book had been filled with words Josiah struggled to sound out, words about freedom, words about the sin of chains. When Ezekiel demanded to know where it came from, Josiah had only stared at him, jaw locked. The lash sang through the air, split flesh, and painted the ground red. Tempe had watched from the shadows, her mouth filled with cloth to stop her cries. That scar across Josiah's shoulders never healed straight. Even now she felt its echo each time she drew breath. Ezekiel's throat was written at the top of her list, and then another recollection, slick as oil. Reverend Crowther accepting a cheap silver cup as payment for a sermon in which he declared, "Servants, obey your masters, for in obedience lies salvation." The words had slithered into the hearts of the quarter like poison, and the cup had glinted in his hand like a chalice of betrayal. Tempe saw again the way he had raised it high, his lips wet with righteousness, his eyes blind to the hunger staring back at him. That cup flashed now in her mind like a blade. The house seemed to breathe around her, every groan of timber a reminder that she had polished its bones, every flutter of curtain a memory of laundering cloths she could never wear. Horror pressed not in blood but in precision, the way she could mark the tilt of a man's head when sleep overtook him, the way she knew which floorboard would betray her if stepped upon wrong, the way she had learned to pour oil upon the iron, key so it would not sing when turned. Slavery had taught her these lessons with merciless patience. Tonight, she would return them. The dogs did not stir. Earlier, she had scattered scraps soaked with laudanum near their chains, watching their jaws slacken as they licked at the meat. She had gathered those drops for months, each one stolen when Prudence was distracted, each one hidden in a hollow reed until enough could dull the fiercest hound. Tonight they slept heavy, their bodies draped across the ground like rugs, even. The knife she carried bore history. She had traded for it in whispers. A tin button slipped to the farrier's boy who dared not look her in the eyes. It was a hoof knife, thin and curved, meant to pare down the hard soul of beasts. Its edge had tasted iron and blood before, though only from animals. Tonight it would learn a new scripture. Tempe had wrapped it in cloth and stitched it into her hem, the thread rough but strong, her own needle puncturing again and again as though rehearsing the wounds to come. And then there was the dust. She had mapped her path not with ink but with footsteps. Each day as she swept she traced invisible roots in the grit, her heel dragging a little to mark the places where she must turn, the places where silence would be greatest. The dust obeyed her. It became a pattern she walked until it felt like prayer, until her body knew it without thought. Tonight she followed it as faithfully as any hymn. The hall stretched before her now, lamplight leaking from beneath the study door. Abel Trask's voice droned, numbers and figures, the monotone of a man who believed columns of ink were more alive than the people they measured. Tempe approached, her shadow stretching long upon the wainscot. Her breath slowed, steadied, every sense sharpened to a blade. She thought of Mercy's fever, of Josiah's scars, of Dorcas' march to the river. She thought of her own name, cut down to letters in a ledger. Through the narrow crack she saw him. Abel Trask hunched over the great desk, spectacles low on his nose, lips moving in the rhythm of his sums. He scratched his pen across the page, paused to lick his finger, turned the leaf and began again. Columns of numbers rose beneath his hand like tombstones. And there, midway down one page, she glimpsed a mark she knew. TR. Her very existence distilled to an entry. Her life nothing more than a cipher in black ink. He never looked up. Tempe stood at the threshold, the knife warm against her skin, her pulse matching the scratch of his quill. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. For the first time in all her years on the Reddick place, she felt unseen not as a chain, but as a freedom. He did not know that the life he had tallied stood in the shadows watching. He did not know that the ink he so carefully poured over the page would soon be written in another color. She waited there, listening to his lips move, watching the quill dance, and felt the arithmetic of vengeance complete its sum. The latch gave way without complaint, and the door opened on the dim warmth of the study. Abel Trask sat hunched at his desk, the lamplight circling him like a crown of gold meant for a usurer's head. His pen scratched tirelessly, ink soaking into thick paper, lips moving with each sum. He was not a man of sweat and field, but of ink and number, and in his hand numbers carried the weight of chains. Tempe's eyes lingered on the open ledger, the neat columns rising like gravestones in a row. Her own ciphered life lay among them. TR. Nestled between tallies of hides and corn bushels. Her fingers drew the hoof knife from her hem, the steel cool against her palm. She stepped inside, silent, the boards obedient beneath her weight. He never looked up. It was the curse of his kind, blind to the lives that moved in the shadows of their dominion. Tempe approached, breath steady, her eyes fixed on the hollow of his neck where the lamp's glow touched his pale flesh. With a swiftness born not of frenzy but of design, she seized a folded square of linen from the desk, a cloth meant for quills, and pressed it across his mouth. His startled breath puffed against her hand, hot and damp. The knife moved as though it had always known the path, parting skin in one clean motion. The sound was brief, a sigh more than a cry. His final taste was not wine nor bread, but the fabric he had measured so stingily for the sick. His hands flailed once, quill snapping between his fingers, and then stilled. Tempe watched the ink spill across the page, blackness spreading over numbers that had claimed to fix her worth. It seemed fitting that his last mark should be blurred into nothing. She took no coin, no trinket. She slid from his waistcoat only the key ring that thudded against her breastbone when she tucked it into her dress, the cold iron heavier than silver. She moved back into the hallway, her breath calm, her step precise. The house seemed to pause with her, rafters creaking faintly, wind tapping at the shutters. The dogs by the kennels stirred not at all. The laudanum she had fed them earlier worked deep into their bones, and they lay sprawled like rugs upon the dirt. Their sides rose and fell in dreamless sleep, their jaws slackened, their ears deaf to what stalked the house. Up the north stair she went, her hand trailing along the rail polished by years of her labor. Each step whispered beneath her weight. She had counted them too many times to falter now. At the landing, the guest chamber door stood slightly ajar. Within, Reverend Phineas Crowther knelt beside his cot, the cheap silver cup gleaming faintly on the washstand. His voice murmured, a half-prayer broken by fatigue. Lord, sanctify this house. Bless obedience. The words faltered as he swayed, his hands lifted as though blessing shadows. Tempe entered without sound, The boards did not betray her. She lowered herself to her knees as if joining him in prayer. He turned, startled, mouth opening to shape a question. She bowed, her head as if humbled, but her hand moved swift and sure. The blade touched his throat like a whisper, an amendment to scripture that could no longer be preached. His hands fluttered upward, pale against the dark like moths beating against glass. His breath rattled once, then fled. His body slumped. To the cot, one arm bent as though still raised in benediction. Tempe lingered only long enough to look upon the silver cup. It gleamed in the lamplight, cheap and gaudy, a chalice for lies. She left it untouched, for it was unworthy of her hand. She stepped into the hall again, her knife hidden once more in her hem, her breath unshaken. The horror of the axe was not in the blood. It was in the stillness that followed, in the calm that wrapped around her like a cloak. Tempe's mind drifted not to frenzy, but to Mercy's tiny breaths, gasping and weak, each one a stitch in the cloth of memory. She thought of the ledger chain that had reduced her child's life to an entry, a figure denied medicine because numbers weighed heavier than flesh. Now the house became her own ledger, and she was closing it one line at a time. The hallway smelled, faintly, of cedar and dust. Quilts folded neatly upon a trunk perfumed the air with lavender, as though Prudence Reddick's hand lingered even in the folds of cloth. Tempe paused there, the shadows pressing in, and memory rose to split the darkness. She saw Prudence once more fitting a mourning veil for herself, laughing lightly about how fine the price had been fetched for a likely boy. The veil fell across her pale brow while her laughter rang sharp, and that sound echoed now in Tempe's chest like a bell tolling in reverse. Her hands tightened upon the knife hidden against her thigh. She moved down the hall, every board known, every sound anticipated. The house seemed to tilt toward her as if drawn by the weight of her resolve. She thought again of stitches, of hems closing. Each act was a seam drawn tight, pulling together, the fabric of vengeance she had woven since Mercy's grave. She stepped into the back passage where the air grew colder, the windows letting in drafts from the marsh. Outside, the night spread wide and silent, the wind freshening, the reeds bowing in chorus. She could hear faintly the voices of Hiram Bell and Silas Alder, laughing drunkenly by the outbuildings, their words slurred, their confidence loosened. She would come to them soon. Their time was measured. She stood still in the dark corridor, her breath even, the silence thick. A frog croaked once in the marsh, then stopped. It was as if the night itself listened, as if the world leaned nearer to hear a new name given to fear. If you're enjoying this dark tale, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next. The night air wrapped itself around Tempe like a damp shroud as she stepped out from the gallery's shadow into the open yard. Above her, the sky sagged low, heavy with clouds, as though the whole of the antebellum South were a lid clamped over a boiling pot. The plantation yard spread wide and dim, lanterns guttering at the fringes, smoke from the kitchens fading into the dark. Out here there was no music, no fiddler's bow sawing merriment. Out here the night belonged to those who enforced silence, with whips and iron. Her footsteps traced the wagon ruts that cut through the yard, each shallow groove a scar left by countless loads of tobacco and corn hauled toward profit. She moved without a shadow, for the moon hid behind thick veils of cloud. Her steps fell with deliberate precision, a catechism rehearsed over months. She had practiced the pace in her mind every night before sleep, whispering it like scripture. 1, 2, pause, shift. The ground obeyed her, the ruts guiding her forward like lines on a ledger that demanded balance. Hiram Bell lay stretched upon a bench outside the smokehouse, one arm dangling, his hat tilted low over his eyes. His mouth moved, mumbling half-dreamt fragments of his life's liturgy. Brought him back strays, made him run till they dropped. Ain't a man, less another man, fears him. His words slurred together, drunk with cider and cruelty. He had built himself from other people's terror, lived by it, fed on it. Now even half asleep he spoke it aloud as if afraid silence might make him vanish. Tempe crouched near, her breath slow, her knife resting in her palm. The air smelled of wood smoke and sour drink. She listened to his words and repeated them, silently, not as belief but as ritual. Every sentence he muttered was one she had heard in some form before. Words that drove chains deeper, words that branded the heart. Tonight, she gave them back to him in final punctuation. She leaned close, pressing the blade beneath his jaw. His lids flickered, a sliver of white showing, his lips parting to form another boast. The knife silenced him with a swiftness that was almost tender. The words died in his throat, unfinished, swallowed by the very silence he had tried to flee. His body jerked once, then sagged, the bench creaking under the sudden weight. Tempe withdrew, breath steady, and stood over him. For the first time, Hiram Bell became what he had never allowed others to be, quiet. She left him there, no dragging, no concealment. The marsh and the morning would speak louder than she could. Let his fellow patrolman find him with the cider, still sticky on his lips, his hat tipped crooked, his boastings ended mid-word. From the smokehouse she moved toward the corn crib where Silas Alder kept watch. He was no better than Hiram, though his cruelty wore another face. He had been the driver in the fields, the one who measured each ounce of corn in rations, who timed every hoe stroke against the sun, who grinned when men bent double with hunger. Silas prided himself on order. He believed the sound of his watch. Bell at dusk kept the quarters bound tighter than chains. Yet tonight his order had dissolved into weariness. Tempe found him slumped against the crib wall, legs splayed, his chin upon his chest. The bell rope hung slack beside him, unused, forgotten, in his drowsing. His breaths came in slow, heavy pulls, the rise and fall of his chest like the swing of a scythe through grain. She studied that rhythm, counted it, made of it a metronome for her hand. One rise, one fall. One rise, one fall. The blade followed the measure. His body twitched, a strangled sound pushing from his throat. Then quiet. The bell rope stirred once, in the faint wind, but made no sound. Tempe stepped back, eyes fixed on him, and for a moment she saw only Josiah's back scarred by lashes, Mercy's mouth open in fever, Dorcas's wrists bound at the landing. Each death tonight was not frenzy but balance. A lifetime of measurements had been taken from her, yards of cloth denied, ounces of corn rationed, minutes stolen from her child's bedside. Now she measured in return. Each stroke was a line, of arithmetic set right. She left Silas where he sat, the bell rope brushing his shoulder. No need to move him. By dawn, the plantation would know. The marsh would carry whispers. Fear would seep through the fields like fog, and the angles of the place would change. Tempe's steps carried her back toward the house. The knife cleaned, only by the cold air, her dress whispering against her legs. She felt no tremor in her hand. The transformation was complete. She had not turned from good to wicked, nor from meek to wild. She had turned from silenced to articulate. Her voice was the blade, and the blade spoke a language the night itself repeated. The plantation seemed to shrink as she approached it again. The windows no longer glowed with untouchable grandeur. The roofline sagged under the weight of the acts committed within and without. The very geometry of the house appeared wrong, angles bent by fear. Its chimneys leaned inward. Its walls drew closer as though the structure sensed that its dominion had been rewritten in blood and silence. The marsh wind freshened, scattering the smoke from the chimneys, carrying it away as though sweeping, the air of old breath. Frogs croaked once, twice, then fell into eerie stillness. Their chorus ended mid-song. The reeds bent low, rustling, as if bowing in witness. Tempe paused on the threshold of the house, her heart calm, her eyes steady. Behind her, the yard bore two bodies left like broken measures. Before her, the house held two more souls she had already stilled, and three, yet waiting. The night was not yet finished. Back inside, the carpet swallowed footfall so completely that Tempe felt as if the house had taken her into its mouth. The corridor smelled of beeswax and old roses. Portraits lined the walls, their varnished eyes catching what light remained and returning it in thin, judgmental glints. Men in militia coats and women in stiff silk stared down through generations as though their will still governed the air. The steps she took between them felt narrower than they had an hour past. A house alters when fear changes hands. Angles misbehave, distances lie. Somewhere beyond the stairwell a clock ticked, the clean, indifferent beat of brass against brass, and from the far rooms came the dull, muffled gusts of a party drowning in its own fatigue. Tempe paused at the turn that led east. That wing held Prudence Reddick. The carpet there was newer, imported patterns purling into vines and smelled faintly of camphor. Tempe knew each stain and shadow upon it. She had knelt with a brush to coax wine from the weft, had patted baking soda into sorrows that refused to lift. She passed the linen press and the little table where Prudence kept a cut crystal scent bottle. She held the farrier's knife flat against her thigh, as one might soothe a feverish child, and listened to the hush on the other side of the door. Breathing. One woman's breath, steady and ornamental as ribbon. Prudence slept with a bonnet pinned at the crown, vanity's habit even in the dark. The pins glinted faintly when clouds parted and let the moon sift into the room. The bed itself was high, a four-poster with a canopy. Its ivory finials gleamed like the tips of small bones. On the chair beside the dressing table lay a folded, black veil, the fine netting Tempe had once lifted when asked to remove lint with damp fingers. Her memory knew the way it caught against a callus. The sewing basket sat open on the table, mother-of-pearl disc, needles nested in their felt lodge, a spool of black silk, a small brass thimble with the dent of Prudence's habitual push. Tempe stepped nearer. Prudence's lips parted in a soft snore that would be pretty if prettiness could live in such a house. Tempe saw, for a moment that would not leave her, the day Mercy burned. Prudence had stooped that afternoon not to the child but to Tempe, tipping her chin with 2 fingers, measuring the line of the jaw with a blank appraisal. Fine bone, that one, she had murmured, as if appraising china. The sentence had not been cruel by design. It had been worse. It had been a craft, learned, practiced, the art of looking away while desiring the shapes of things. Tempe felt that cold lesson pressing upon her even now. The dread in this room was not noise but restraint. She must enter, act, depart, and, within that narrow act, wrestle not only with vengeance but with the knowledge that the mistress had trained herself to vanish from cruelty while standing at its side. The ache that lifted in Tempe's chest was not mercy. It was the ache of womanhood bruised by womanhood. She thought of how Prudence had set young girls' hands to hems and had praised small stitches while a driver's whip sang in the yard. How she had taught them to sew straight by making them watch their own fingers and not the window where men were sold. Tempe took the folded square of linen from the washstand, the same linen she had ironed until its edges could stand. She moved like a woman adjusting covers, a caretaker tending to sleep. The house breathed once as if surprised. She pressed the cloth to Prudence's mouth and nose, and Prudence's hands fluttered, pretty and useless, like moths resisting. A lantern. The blade traveled not as spectacle but as thread, a quick, invisible finish to a seam that had always been there. The sound that followed was softer than the sigh cloth makes when pulled free from a drawer. Tempe held the linen until the body beneath it loosened and lay very still, the bonnet pins bright as little stars in hair gone slack. She stood very straight, quiet as a wardrobe. Her eyes moved about the room, at the vanity where a cameo brooch gleamed, at the scent bottle, at the shallow dish with stray pins. All this gloss had been fashioned upon other people's backs, yet Tempe took nothing. She set the linen neatly at the edge of the washstand, as if she were ending the nightly ritual of folding. She drew the covers to Prudence's chin and, without knowing she had meant to, smoothed the sheet where a heat had been. The portraits watched. Tempe felt their painted pupils slide across her, and she realized with a small start that the gaze she had known her whole life, those fixed, claiming eyes, had nothing to say to her now. She had become illegible to them. She turned from Prudence's room and returned to the corridor where the smelling of beeswax seemed sharper. The clock ticked on, thinnest metronome of the hour. Someone in a distant parlor laughed too loudly, and then coughed. The sound came attenuated like a noise in a dream. Westward lay Colonel Ambrose Reddick. The carpet here was older. The pile had gone flat along a path of command. Tempe passed the oil portrait of Ambrose as a younger man, uniform, coat, hand upon a book, and remembered the first day she saw him at the Cambridge block. She had been made to stand with shoulders back, chin up, as a crier chanted qualities as if they were virtues. Ambrose had lifted his cane, the ivory knob flashing, and the auctioneer's chant had shifted around him as the tide shifts around the keel of a ship. The gavel fell. Temperance, sound and strong. For weeks after, Tempe had drunk rice water because grief undid her stomach. Everything she swallowed came back up as if her body refused to accept a world so arranged. Even when it quieted, she could not look at a kettle without thinking of that courtly lift of the cane. Ambrose's door was shut but not latched. She eased it inward with the back of her hand and waited to hear the sibilant fabric of snore. It came, heavy, proprietary, as if air itself owed him a tithe. The room smelled of tobacco and the starch of clean shirts. His cane rested against the bedpost like a scepter at the edge of a throne. Moonlight made the varnish on the cane's knob into a small, varnished moon. Tempe did not cross the threshold at once. She stood in the doorway long enough to let his face become a map of every road she had been made to walk. Furrows plowed, paths to the river landing, the trampled ways between cabins and fields. The slope of his cheek was the hill she had climbed carrying pails. The creases at his mouth were the creeks over which she had hauled soaked linens. She let the geography settle. She had learned to memorize maps that other people drew. Tonight, she drew one of her own. Ambrose shifted, lips smacking. A dream's vapors busied with a feast only he could taste. Tempe entered. The carpet accepted her feet like earth accepts rain. She closed her hand around the folded linen once more. Not the one from Prudence's washstand, but its twin she had taken earlier from a stack in the passage. She pressed it to the mouth that had fixed prices while chewing meat. The eye flicked, open, then lost interest. Sleep tried to defend its king. The blade in Tempe's other hand did the work it had learned. The act was brief, a sentence ending, a tithe taken. The clock in the hall marked 2 slow beats during the whole of it. As if time were unwilling to be implicated, the house seemed to tilt, or perhaps it only sighed in some deep timber. Tempe stepped back, set the linen aside, and for the first time in years felt air move through her chest, without catching. She did not feel taller. She felt exact, no more, no less. The noises from the far side of the house had gone thin. A door closed, feet shuffled, a chair leg scraped. In yards beyond the brick walk, the marsh gathered itself tighter, wind combing the reeds into a single low bow. On the washstand, a porcelain basin stood beside a pitcher painted with forget-me-nots. Tempe poured, and the water struck the bowl, with a sound like small bells. Moonlight lay upon the surface like a coin sunk to the bottom of a well. She washed her hands there, the water reddening in a cloud that looked for a moment like watered silk before it thinned to pale. She could not help but think of all the times she had stood at such a basin to scrub someone else's lace, someone else's collar, someone else's stain. Now the bowl took what the night demanded of her and kept quiet. The mirror above the washstand was warped, the glass old, imperfect. Faces came back with waves in them as if the person within were glimpsed through heat. Tempe lifted her eyes, and the woman who looked back at her was not a monster. She was a woman whose sorrow had finally learned its grammar. Sorrow had conjugations, had moods. For years hers had been forced into the imperative voice. Work, bear, hush, obey. Tonight it spoke in declaratives, spare and complete. She did not smile, she did not frown, she breathed. In the pane behind her, the cane by the bedpost made a small vertical line like the stem of a letter. She dried her hands on a towel she had boiled and bleached a dozen times and moved to the study. Not Abel Trask's. She had already stilled that mouth. But the smaller counting room that Prudence used to keep household tallies. Candles, sugar, thread. On the desk, beneath a sheaf of invoices, lay a narrower ledger, the one whose columns tracked clothing allotments and sick room expenditures. Tempe turned the pages with careful fingers until she found the month Mercy died. The entry sat cramped between lines for soap and needles. Syrup for child. Declined. Beneath it, in a different hand, almost prim, no allowance. Expense. Not justified. Her own initials, reduced further, glared from the margin like a smudge someone had tried to rub out. The page made a papery whisper as she lifted its corner. She worked it free with the steadiness of a woman teasing a thread, lest the tear run crooked. The sheet came loose with a gentle sigh. She folded it into thirds and slid it into the bodice of her dress, flat against her heart, as if rescuing a drowning scrap of herself. Other things winked at her, the little key to Prudence's jewel box, a sealed packet with Ambrose's name, 2 Spanish coins held for flair. She ignored them. Wealth in this house was a language she could read but would not speak. She had no pocket that wished to be heavy with their silver. She had taken what mattered, a record undone, a truth to hold when the next hours closed upon her. She returned to the passage. The carpet seemed to lie flatter now, as if the threads had accepted some pressure long overdue. She felt no rush in, her blood, only that same exactness like a seam lane true. 2 rooms behind her were quiet with the final quiet. 2 beyond that waited for morning to make its announcement. 1 yet remained, the loft above the tack room, where Ezekiel kept, his boots and his pride near to hand. Tempe paused at the head of the back stair and listened. The faint rasp of a mouse within the wainscot, the steady tick of the hall clock, the continent of the night rolling its slow tide against the edges of the house. She pressed her palm to the banister she had polished until it reflected knuckles like dull coins. The grain lifted beneath her skin, and for a moment, absurdly, she remembered a day in spring when pollen had filmed every surface yellow and she had wiped and the dust returned, golden and insolent. Work that never finished. Work that laughed as it repeated. Tonight's labor had finish in it. She felt that like cool water at the back of the tongue. Before she descended, she stepped once more into Ambrose's room and looked at the cane beside the bed. She did not touch it. A cane can be a staff, a scepter, a cudgel. It can also be only wood. Tonight it was nothing. The portraits in the corridor seemed to lose their posture. Their varnished eyes dulled as though the oil within them had met too much moon. When she reached the landing, she paused and drew a breath, slow and spare. Beyond the door, the marsh wind shifted, bringing in a tang of salt and rot. The house's geometry had changed indeed, its fixed assumptions buckled. The stairs led down to a first floor that no longer belonged to the names engraved upon the family Bible, but to the woman moving through it with a knife hidden in an old hem. Tempe went down. At the bottom step, she glanced toward the front hall, where a tiered candelabrum guttered in its own smoke. The party's last candles were dying too. She crossed to the side entry where the latch opened to the yard and felt the cold slip under her cuffs. Under the eaves, the night gathered itself. Like cloth before a cut, she tightened the folded ledger page against her chest with the heel of her hand, not from fear of losing it, but as if to remind her ribs what they were carrying. She did not look back at the rooms she had left. She did not straighten the bedclothes again, nor put the linen away, nor wash the basin a second time. She had served the house last and finally. Her hand found the door's iron and she stepped out toward the yard, where the path to the tack room ran like a black line across a slate. The house behind her gave one small settling sound, timber acknowledging weight redistributed, and then held its breath. Dawn was still a rumor when the marsh birds began their thin questions, testing the edge of light with tentative notes. The air tasted of iron and water, the smell of reeds bending under dew. Tempe moved with the hush of someone whose body had already learned its last lesson. There was only one throat left, and it belonged to Ezekiel Hartwell. She had kept him for the end, because Ezekiel had taught her the nature of fear. Never in storms, always in doses. A lash here, a word there, a shadow cast long across the quarters, so men bent before the whip struck. He had been the overseer of fear, feeding it in small measured spoonfuls until it lived inside every bone. Tonight he would see the cup overturned, The tack room loft loomed in the gray dark, its boards blackened with pitch and dust. Tempe knew he would wake easily. He was not a drunkard like Hiram, not a dreamer like Silas. His sleep was the light, kind of a man who trusts no silence. She climbed the short ladder and stood in the doorway until the murmur of her breath became part of the room. Ezekiel stirred, lips smacking, a hand brushing across his mouth. His eyes opened. For a moment confusion swam in them, the blur of sleep still thick. Then they fixed on her, and she saw the instant he understood. Not that she carried a knife, not that she had come to kill, but that she stood before him no longer as chattel but as scripture. His body froze, though his eyes widened. He tried to sit, but her gaze held him like iron. The terror was not in what she carried, but in what she no longer concealed. Tempe did not hurry. She let him see her face, calm as water. She let him understand that nothing frantic guided her hand, only completion. He whispered her name, half sneer, half plea, and in that syllable lay all the years he had stolen from her. She cut the sound away before he could shape another. The knife moved, and silence settled like ash. His eyes remained open, fixed not on her but on the rafters where the first gray of morning began to seep. She descended the ladder and stepped into the yard. Behind her the loft stood mute, and ahead of her the plantation began to stir. A woman screamed, high, brittle, cracking at the edges, the cry of someone who had found prudence laid quiet. A boy dropped his pail at the pump, the clang of iron against stone ringing across the yard. Men shouted, their boots slapping against boards as they ran for rifles stacked in the hall. But the rifles would not snarl. The dogs lay slack as rugs, their jaws heavy, their bodies swaddled in the laudanum she had fed them. The whole place stuttered in confusion, fear rising without teeth to carry it. Tempe did not run. The marsh could have swallowed her, its reeds parting, its mud receiving her steps until she vanished into myth. She walked instead, steady, toward the edge of water where earth turned soft underfoot and the air grew sharp with metal. She stopped, there feeling the ground tremble faintly as the tide shifted, smelling the tang that always clung to Blackwater Creek. Memory folded into the moment. Mercy's heat upon her palm, the tiny fingers curling even as fever ate the breath from her chest. Josiah's back after Ezekiel's lash, skin torn into a map of rivers. Reverend Crowther's hymn rising in the chapel the Sunday after a man was sold, Rock of Ages sung with lips that would never taste hunger. All of it pressed against her now, past and present collapsing until her heart could no longer tell one from the other. She considered the reeds. She imagined stepping into them, becoming a ghost for the children to whisper about. They would tell each other of the woman who walked into Blackwater and never returned, whose footsteps turned to ripples, whose voice rattled in the wind over the marsh at night. That ending called to her, yet she turned instead. She would not dissolve. She would be seen, her hands bare, hair unbound. She walked back toward the lane, the pail still rolled by the pump, clattering weakly as it settled. She passed the corn crib, where Silas had slumped, his head tilted as if in uneasy sleep. She passed the smokehouse bench where cider still pooled beneath Hiram's limp hand. She stepped over the wagon ruts and into the clearing where the posse gathered. They shouted at first, rifles lifted, but their hands shook. She had unstrung their confidence, and the courage of men who live by fear is a thin thread once cut. None fired. Instead, one of them, face pale, voice quavering, stepped forward and bound her wrists with coarse rope. She did not resist. The cord bit into her skin, but she felt no sting. She walked where they led her, back down the lane, as if each footstep were the toll of a bell she herself had set ringing. The wagon jolted, wheels crunching chaff and husk, scattering bits of straw into the morning. The men glanced at her and looked away, their eyes filled with the knowledge that something had shifted beyond their reach. The ride to Cambridge was short, but each rattle of the cart sounded like a drum. Her fate was certain and swift. In a place that believed law was a mirror reflecting its own virtue, there would be no hesitation. A noose would be fashioned, the crowd would gather, and she would be displayed as proof that order remained. But in the eyes of those who watched, In the dreams of those who came after, another truth would gnaw. That one woman had written her own ledger in the blood of 7. The narrative foreshadowed its end. They would hang her at the edge of town, where children might see if they dared. The witnesses would eat their supper that night and feel Blackwater licking at their boots beneath the table. They would remember her face unbound, her eyes clear, and they would not sleep easy. The plantation would continue. That was the coldest horror of all, cold as January wind through broken shutters. Men would still walk its rows, women would still bear its weight. Yet something had cracked. A story would walk its halls now, whispering against every door. Men would check their locks twice. Women would pin their bonnets at night, their fingers trembling without knowing why. Tempe's last look was not for the house, but for the marsh. It lay wide and waiting, its water dark, its reeds bowing. It did not sink what it received. It held its secrets and let them breathe. Above it, the sky filled with geese crossing in sharp lines, wings creaking, their bodies refusing to settle. Tempe lifted her eyes to them, the ropes biting her wrists, and felt the tide of grief loosen for a moment. She could not resurrect what was lost, but she had rearranged forever what a night could mean. Subscribe for more macabre stories and comment with your thoughts on this chilling tale. The wagon rolled on and Blackwater fell behind. The geese crossed unbroken into the light that widened on the horizon. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and comment with other historical horror stories you'd like to hear.